The moment the stagecoach door creaked open, Clara Whitfield's hand shot to her sleeve, yanking the fabric down over her wrist before a single soul could see the bruise blooming beneath it. She forced a smile. She always forced a smile. But when the tall stranger reached up to help her down, she flinched so hard she nearly fell, and in that one broken second, Cowboy Nathan Cole saw everything her smile was built to hide. He didn't ask her name first. He asked low and steady, "Ma'am, who hurt you?" Before we go any further, if you're watching this tonight from your own hometown, drop the name of your city in the comments below so I can see just how far Clara's story has traveled. And if stories like this move, you hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next changes everything. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in a cloud of dust, and before the driver had even set the brake, Clara Whitfield's hand shot to her sleeve, yanking the fabric down over her wrist. Habit. Instinct. Survival. She forced her lips into the same practiced smile she had worn for 300 miles. The smile that said, "Nothing is wrong here." The smile that had kept her alive for 6 long years. "Red Willow, miss," the driver called down. "End of the line." Clara gathered her worn suitcase against her chest like a shield and stepped toward the door. Her boots found the wooden step, then the dirt, and for one moment, she simply stood there blinking in the harsh Wyoming sun, feeling the eyes of the whole town settle on her like a weight. A cluster of women stood outside the mercantile parasols, tilted whispering behind gloved hands. One of them, a sharp-faced woman in a stiff blue bonnet, leaned toward her companion and murmured just loud enough to carry. "Well, will you look at that? Another one of them mail-order girls. Wonder what's wrong with her that she couldn't find a husband back home." "Probably ran from something," the other one answered. "They always are." Clara's spine went rigid, but her face didn't change. She had trained her face not to change. She had learned that a flinch, a flush, a single crack in the mask could cost her more than she was willing to pay. So she stood there in the dust, chin lifted, and pretended she hadn't heard a word. That was when she saw him. He was walking toward her from across the street, unhurried. The kind of walk that belonged to a man who had never once needed to prove anything to anybody. Tall, broad through the shoulders, a gray hat pulled low against the sun, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, steady, quiet watching. Nathan Cole. She knew him only from the letters. 3 of them in careful, deliberate handwriting, each one shorter than the last, each one asking fewer questions than the one before. "I have a ranch outside Red Willow. 200 head of cattle, more land than I know what to do with, and no wife to help me run the house. I am not a man of many words, Miss Whitfield, but I am a man of my word. If you come, I promise you will be safe here." She had read that last line so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. Safe. She hadn't believed it. Not really. Safety was a word men used before they took something from you. She had learned that lesson with her knuckles pressed white against her own palms, learned it in a house where every closed door meant something different than it should have. But she had come anyway, because the alternative was staying. And staying meant one more year, maybe one more month, maybe one more night under Thomas Caldwell's roof. Nathan stopped a few feet from her and removed his hat, holding it against his chest, the way a man might hold something he respected. "Miss Whitfield." His voice was low, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and intended to spend every second of it being careful with her. "Yes." The word came out smaller than she meant it to. "Mr. Cole." "Nathan," he said. "Just Nathan, if that suits you." She nodded because nodding was safer than speaking, and reached down to lift her suitcase from where the driver had set it in the dirt. Her fingers curled around the handle, and her sleeve rode up just an inch, just long enough. Nathan's eyes moved, not to her face, not to her dress, to the thin line of purple-yellow bruising circling her wrist like a bracelet she had never chosen to wear. She saw him see it. Her whole body went cold. She yanked the suitcase up and pulled her sleeve down in the same motion so fast it looked almost violent, and she took a half-step back before she could stop herself, putting distance between them, the way she had learned to put distance between herself and any man whose face changed too quickly. But his face didn't change the way she expected. There was no curiosity in it. No hunger for the story. No judgment either. No, what did you do to deserve that? No flicker of suspicion that she was trouble-damaged goods, a woman who'd brought her own ruin down on herself. Instead, something in his jaw tightened just slightly, like a man setting down a weight he intended to carry for a while. "Let me get that for you," he said, nodding at the suitcase, keeping his hands visible, keeping his voice even. He didn't reach for it. He waited. "I can manage," Clara said quickly. "I know you can." He held her gaze. "Doesn't mean you have to." Something about the way he said it, not a command, not a plea, just a simple fact laid down between them, made her loosen her grip just a little. She let him take the suitcase. Their fingers didn't touch. He turned toward the wagon waiting at the edge of the street, and Clara fell into step beside him, careful to keep half a pace of distance, careful to walk on the side away from his hand. She didn't know she was doing it until she noticed him notice it the way his eyes dropped briefly to the gap she'd left between them, and then away, like he'd filed the observation somewhere private and decided not to comment. Behind them, the whispering women hadn't stopped. "Reckon she'll last the winter," one of them said, not quietly enough. "They never do the sad ones. Something always sends them running." Nathan stopped walking. He turned slow and deliberate and looked at the women with an expression Clara had never seen a man wear in her defense before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and steadier than anger, something that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. "Mrs. Higgins?" He touched the brim of his hat, polite as Sunday. "This is Miss Whitfield. She's had a long journey, and I expect she'd appreciate a kinder welcome than gossip in the street. Wouldn't you agree?" Mrs. Higgins went the color of a ripe tomato. "Well, I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Nathan's voice stayed quiet, and somehow that made it worse for her than shouting would have. "I'd take it as a kindness if you didn't mean it again." He turned back to Clara before the woman could answer, and just like that, the matter was closed. Not with violence, not with a raised fist, but with 6 calm sentences that left no room for argument. Clara stood frozen for a moment, staring at him, trying to understand what she had just witnessed. In her old life, defending someone cost blood. It cost bruises. It cost a night locked in a room with no supper. She had learned not to let anyone defend her, because the price was always higher than the insult itself. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, once they were walking again. "I know." Nathan set her suitcase into the wagon bed. "Didn't do it because I had to." "Then why?" He looked at her, and for just a moment, something old and sad moved behind his eyes. "Had a sister once, younger than me by 6 years. Folks used to talk about her the same way sad little things, something wrong with her, wonder what happened. Nobody ever asked her straight out if she was all right. They just talked about her instead of to her." His jaw worked. "I don't make that mistake twice." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She climbed up into the wagon before he could offer his hand to help her, because she wasn't ready not yet to let a man's hand close around hers, even in kindness. Especially in kindness. Kindness had a way of turning in her experience. Kindness was often just patience wearing a mask waiting for the right moment to become something else. Nathan noticed that too. He noticed everything she was beginning to realize and said nothing about most of it. He climbed up beside her, careful to leave a full arm's length of space on the bench, and picked up the reins. "Ranch is about an hour out," he said. "Nothing much to see between here and there. Just grass and sky and more grass." "That sounds—" She searched for the word. "Peaceful." "It is." He clicked his tongue and the horses started forward. "Peaceful as anywhere I know." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels grinding over the dry road, the town shrinking behind them into a smudge of rooftops and dust. Clara kept her eyes on the horizon, on the endless gold-brown grass rolling out in every direction, and let herself breathe. Really breathe for what felt like the first time in years. "Mr. Cole," she said eventually. "Nathan." "Yes, ma'am. In your letters, you said I'd be safe." Her hands twisted together in her lap. I need to know what that means, exactly, before we go any further." He didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, on the horses, giving her the courtesy of not staring at her, while she asked the hardest question she knew how to ask. "It means," he said slowly, "that nobody on my land is going to raise a hand to you. Not me, not any man who works for me, ever. It means your room has a lock, and you keep the only key. It means if you tell me to leave you be, I leave you be, and I don't ask twice why." He paused. "It means this marriage is a name on a piece of paper, and a roof over your head, and nothing more than that, unless you decide someday you want it to be more." Clara's throat tightened so fast it hurt. "Why would you offer that? Most men who send for a bride want a—" She stopped herself. "Want a wife in every sense of the word starting the first night." Nathan finished for her, quiet matter of fact. "I imagine that's what you're used to men wanting from you." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. "I'm not most men," he said. "I've got a ranch that needs running, and a house that's been empty too long, and I got tired of eating supper alone at a table built for a family. That's the truth of what I want, Miss Whitfield. The rest is yours to decide in your own time or not at all." The wagon hit a rut and jostled them both. Clara's hand flew out instinctively to brace herself against the bench, and Nathan's hand moved just as fast, catching her elbow to steady her before she could tip. She flinched. It happened before she could stop it. A full-body flinch. Her breath catching her shoulders, curling inward, every muscle bracing for a blow that didn't come and never would. Nathan released her the instant he felt her tense, pulling his hand back like he'd touched a hot stove, and the wagon rolled on in silence, while Clara sat rigid, mortified, staring at her own white-knuckled hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Nothing to be sorry for. I didn't mean to—" "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about the gentleness of it made her look up despite herself. "You don't owe me an apology for flinching. Man reaches toward you sudden-like, and your body remembers things your mind wishes it could forget. That's not weakness. That's just what surviving looks like sometimes." Her eyes stung hot and sudden, and she turned her face toward the fields so he wouldn't see. Nobody had ever said something like that to her. Not once. Thomas had called her flinching pathetic, had called her fear and insult to him, as though her body's memory of pain was somehow a personal attack on his pride. "You don't know anything about me," she said, but there was no bite in it, just exhaustion. "No, ma'am, I don't," Nathan agreed easily. "But I know what fear looks like on a person, and I know it when I see it, and I know better than to pretend I don't. Whatever happened to you before you got here, that's yours to tell or not tell in your own time. I'm not going to pry it out of you sitting in a wagon on the first hour we've known each other. And if I never tell you, then I reckon we'll go on just fine without me knowing." He glanced at her just briefly, just long enough for her to see he meant it. "Your past isn't a toll I'm charging you to cross onto my land, Miss Whitfield. You don't owe me your wounds to earn your supper." Clara looked down at her wrist, at the sleeve covering the bruise she was certain he'd seen, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself wonder, just for a moment, what it might feel like to stop being afraid. They rode the rest of the way, mostly in silence, but it wasn't the silence she was used to. It wasn't the silence of a house where the wrong word could crack the air like a whip. It was something else, something almost gentle. When the ranch finally came into view, a modest farmhouse with a wide porch, a barn weathered gray by seasons of wind, fences stretching out across land that seemed to go on forever. Nathan pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate and set the brake. "This is it," he said. "Not much, but it's honest ground." Clara climbed down before he could offer his hand the same as before, and stood for a moment taking it in. No shouting came from inside the house, no sound of someone waiting to find fault with her before she'd even crossed the threshold. Just wind moving through grass and somewhere distant cattle lowing, and Nathan standing a respectful few feet away, waiting for her to decide when she was ready to walk toward her own front door. "There's a room made up for you," he said. "Has its own lock, like I said. I sleep in the room at the end of the hall, and there's a good deal of house between us, if that eases your mind any." "It does," Clara admitted quietly. "There's a woman, Mrs. Aldridge, comes twice a week to help with the heavier chores. Otherwise, it's just me and the hands, and they don't come up to the house without good reason." He picked up her suitcase again. "I know this is a lot to take in all at once. You don't have to have any of it figured out tonight. Tonight you just rest." She followed him up the porch steps, her legs unsteady beneath her, not from the journey, but from something else. The strange, disorienting sensation of being somewhere. Nobody wanted anything from her yet. The door creaked open into a plain, clean kitchen. A table set for two, that had clearly been set and reset more than once, while he waited on her arrival, nervous in his own quiet way. "I made stew," he said, almost sheepish, setting her suitcase by the stairs. "Can't promise it's good, can promise it's hot." Clara stood in the doorway of a house that smelled like wood smoke and stew, and nothing like fear, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not pain this time, but something dangerously close to hope. And hope, she knew from bitter experience, was the most fragile and the most reckless thing a woman like her could allow herself to feel. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the words could carry. They sat down to supper across from each other, the lamp between them, throwing soft light over the table, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Clara ate carefully, watching him from beneath her lashes, the way she'd learned to watch every man who'd ever shared a table with her, reading his hands, his jaw, the set of his shoulders, searching for the first warning signs of temper. The way other women might search for compliments, she found none. He ate slowly, deliberately, and when he caught her watching him, he didn't demand to know why. He simply offered her more bread and let the silence stay comfortable between them. "You're not going to ask me anything," she said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "Didn't figure you for a woman who wants to be asked things," Nathan said. "Figured you for a woman who's been asked plenty and told what the right answers were supposed to be, and I don't much care for that kind of asking." Clara set down her spoon. Her hands were trembling just slightly, and she pressed them flat against her skirt to still them. "My guardian," she said, the words coming out before she'd decided to let them. "After my parents passed, he raised me, if you could call it that." Her voice thinned. He didn't like to be questioned. Didn't like much of anything most days. "I learned early on that the safest thing I could do was disappear a little, take up less space, make less noise." Nathan didn't move, didn't reach for her, didn't fill the silence with something clumsy and well-meaning that would only make her feel smaller. He just listened the way she imagined a person was supposed to listen, like her words mattered more than his own reaction to them. "I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride because it was the only door I could find that led anywhere but backward." She went on quieter now. "I didn't know if you'd be different. I didn't let myself hope you would be. Hoping for things has never gone well for me. I'm not going to tell you I understand what that was like," Nathan said finally. "Wouldn't be honest, and I don't figure you for a woman who wants comfortable lies. But I'll tell you this much, whatever he did to make you flinch at a hand reaching toward you, whatever he did to make you thank a man for setting down your own suitcase, that was never about anything lacking in you. That was about what was broken in him." Clara's eyes burned. She looked down at her bowl at the stew going cold and pressed her lips together hard to keep from coming undone right there at his table on her very first night. "You don't know that," she whispered. "I know cruelty, when its shadow's still sitting across the table from me," Nathan said, gentler now. "I know what a woman looks like when she's spent years learning to survive a man instead of live her own life. And I know, Clara, that whatever scars you're carrying under that sleeve, they don't make you less. They make you a woman who's still standing after somebody tried real hard to knock her down. That's not shame. That's not something to hide from me. That's the bravest thing I ever heard a person describe over a bowl of my terrible stew." A sound escaped her, then something caught between a laugh and a sob, and she covered her mouth with her hand, startled by her own reaction. Nathan's mouth curved just slightly at the corner, not mockery, just warmth, just relief at hearing something in the room besides fear. "It's not that terrible," she managed. "Ma'am, I've burned water. Don't be kind on my account." That startled a real laugh out of her, small and rusty, like a door hinge that hadn't been used in years, and Clara pressed her hand against her chest as though she could hold the sound inside her, keep it safe, keep it from being taken away, the way everything good in her life had eventually been taken away. Nathan watched her laugh with something like wonder on his face, like he'd just witnessed something rare and worth protecting. "There's a room upstairs whenever you're ready," he said, standing clearing his bowl before she could rise to do it for him, because she would have, she realized out of pure habit, out of years of learning that a woman who didn't serve fast enough paid for her slowness. "Take whatever time you need. Nobody in this house is keeping score of how long you sit at that table." She sat there a while longer after he'd gone up, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall, listening to a door close, softly, respectfully. No slam, no statement being made by the sound of it. And she let herself cry quietly into her own hands. Not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, overwhelming weight of being somewhere safe for the first time she could remember. That night in the small room with the lock she alone controlled, Clara lay awake long after the house had gone still. Moonlight fell in a pale stripe across the quilt, and she stared at it, turning her wrist over in the dim light, tracing the bruise with one careful finger. Thomas's voice came to her anyway, the way it always did in the quiet hours, low and cold and certain. "You'll never find anyone else who'll have you. You think anybody wants a woman who cries this easy, who flinches at nothing." She had believed him for years. Believed it the way a person believes the ground beneath their feet without question, because questioning it had only ever earned her worse. But tonight, lying in a bed that was hers, in a house where a man had defended her to a stranger's face, and then quietly cleared her dish so she wouldn't have to. Thomas's voice sounded thinner than it used to, further away, like a storm that had finally passed over the horizon and left her standing in ground gone quiet. She thought of Nathan's words at the supper table. "That's the bravest thing I ever heard a person describe." Nobody had ever called her brave before. Nobody had ever looked at her scars, the ones beneath her sleeve, the ones beneath her skin, and seen anything but weakness, anything but a woman too broken to be worth the trouble. Down the hall she heard Nathan's door creak, once footsteps pause outside her own door, not trying the handle, not lingering with any intent she needed to fear, just pausing. The way a man checks a fence line before he turns in for the night, making sure everything on his land is as it should be. "Good night, Miss Whitfield," he said through the door, quiet enough not to startle her, loud enough to be heard. "Lock's yours. Rest easy." She heard him walk on, heard his own door close a moment later, and lay there in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that wasn't hunting for her weaknesses, whined against the shutters. A horse shifting in the barn, the ordinary creak of old wood settling for the night. "Good night, Nathan," she whispered back, though she knew he couldn't hear her anymore, and for the first time in 6 years, Clara Whitfield closed her eyes without bracing for what might come through the door. Morning arrived, gray and gentle light easing through the curtains rather than crashing through them, and Clara woke slowly, confused, for one disoriented moment about where she was. No shouting to wake, to no urgent scramble to be dressed and useful before someone's temper found a reason to flare. Just birdsong and the smell of coffee drifting faintly up the stairs. She dressed carefully, choosing a high-collared blouse with long sleeves, despite the warmth already building in the summer air, and made her way down to the kitchen, bracing herself out of habit for whatever mood might be waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Nathan was at the stove sleeves rolled to his elbows, doing a passable job of frying eggs. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face, plain unguarded relief, that she was there, that she'd slept, that the night hadn't undone whatever fragile peace they'd built at the supper table, made her chest ache in a way she didn't have words for yet. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's on. Eggs are an ongoing experiment." "I could help," Clara offered, and then caught herself waiting for the sharp correction. The reminder that her help hadn't been asked for, that speaking up out of turn cost something. "I'd like that," Nathan said instead, simply handing her the spatula like it was the most natural exchange in the world. "Truth told, I've been making a mess of breakfast alone for longer than I care to admit." They worked side by side at the stove, close enough that their elbows brushed once-twice, and each time Clara felt her body tense out of old instinct, and each time nothing happened. No sharp word, no sudden hand, just Nathan quietly moving a step to the side to give her more room, adjusting himself around her comfort without being asked, without making a show of the accommodation. "You've done this before," he observed, watching her crack eggs with practiced efficiency. "The cooking. I did most of the cooking where I came from." Her voice stayed even, but something flickered behind her eyes. "It was safer that way. Kept me in the kitchen, away from other rooms." Nathan didn't ask which rooms. He didn't need to. He simply nodded. Filing it away the way she was coming to understand, he filed everything away carefully, respectfully, without demanding more of the story than she was ready to give. "Well," he said instead, "you'll find the kitchen here belongs to you if you want it. Nobody's going to make you hide in it. But nobody's going to make you leave it either if it's where you feel steadiest." Clara looked at him for a long moment. This quiet, careful man who had somehow understood without being told that safety wasn't the absence of danger so much as the presence of choice, the simple, radical freedom to decide for herself where she stood and how close and for how long. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling less foreign in her mouth each time she used them. "Don't thank me yet," Nathan said, sliding a slightly overcooked egg onto her plate with a rueful half-smile. "Wait till you've tasted my cooking. And despite everything, despite 6 years of learned fear, despite a wrist still tender beneath her sleeve, despite a past that followed her in a stranger's voice." Through the dark, Clara Whitfield laughed again, easy and unguarded, in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and second chances. After breakfast, Nathan carried the dishes to the basin himself before she could reach them, and when he caught her watching, he only shrugged. "Man who lets his wife do all the work isn't much of a man, way I see it. Doesn't matter what kind of marriage this is." "I don't mind working," Clara said quickly. "I want to be useful. I don't know how to just sit still in a house and be given things." Something in his face softened at that, like he understood exactly what she meant and exactly what it had cost her to learn it. "All right," he said. "Then I'll show you the place, and you can decide what you want a hand in. But I want it understood plain, nothing here is a debt you're working off. You eat whether you lift a finger or not." She followed him out onto the porch into a morning gone bright and warm, the grass stretching gold to the horizon, under a sky so wide it made her feel for the first time in years like there was room enough in the world for her to breathe. 2 men were working near the barn, mending a section of fence, and they looked up when Nathan and Clara approached. One of them, older, gray at the temples, straightened and pulled off his hat. "Mornin', boss." "Ma'am." "Miss Whitfield, this is Ezra. Been with me 8 years now, knows this land better than I do most days." Nathan gestured to the younger man beside him. "And this here's Tom Sawicki. Good hand, better sense than his card-playing suggests." "Ma'am," Tom said, ducking his head, polite and awkward the way young men often were around a new face. Clara nodded to them both, and Ezra's eyes flicked briefly to Nathan. A question passed silently between the 2 men, the kind of look that meant something had already been discussed, some understanding already settled. "Boys." Nathan said, his voice carrying the same even unhurried authority she'd heard him use on Mrs. Higgins in town. "Miss Whitfield is my wife, and she'll be running this house. I expect the same respect from you toward her as you'd give me. More if it comes to it. Anybody's got a problem with that arrangement, they can collect their pay this afternoon." "No problem here, boss," Ezra said easily, and there was something steady and sincere in the way he said it. No performance to it, just a man who trusted his employer's word enough not to question it. Ranch runs smoother with a woman keeping the books straight anyhow. Nathan here couldn't balance a ledger if his life depended on it. "That's slander," Nathan said, but there was warmth in it. Easy warmth, the kind that came from years of trust built brick by brick. "Don't let him fool you, Miss Whitfield. Man's sharper than a skinning knife when he wants to be." Clara watched the exchange with a kind of quiet astonishment. There was no undercurrent of threat in it, no test being administered to see how she'd react, no jockeying for power, the way she'd learned to expect whenever men gathered in a yard. Just easy talk. Just men who liked their work and respected the one who employed them. "I'll try not to disappoint the Ledgers," she said, and Ezra laughed a real laugh, surprised and pleased, and something in Clara's chest loosened another notch. They walked the property through the morning, Nathan pointing out the smokehouse, the root cellar, the chicken coop with its dozen hens scratching in the dirt, the garden gone half wild with summer squash and beans climbing untamed up their stakes. "Nobody's kept this up proper since my mother passed," he admitted, standing at the edge of the garden with something rueful in his expression. "I can keep 200 head of cattle alive through a Wyoming winter, but I never did learn what a tomato wants from me." "I can fix that," Clara said, and surprised herself with how quickly the offer came, how much she meant it. "My mother kept a garden, before." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Then it's yours," Nathan said simply. "Whatever you want to grow in it, however you want to grow it. I won't pretend to know the first thing about advising you." They spent an hour there, Clara on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the beans, while Nathan crouched nearby, mostly useless, by his own admission, handing her tools when she asked and staying quiet when she didn't. It was easy. In a way she hadn't expected easy, to feel no clock ticking toward some invisible deadline of usefulness, no sense that her worth in that garden was being measured and found wanting. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually, sitting back on her heels, dirt on her hands, sun warm on the back of her neck. "Ask away." "Why did you really send for a bride? A man like you could have any woman in that town or near enough. You didn't need to write to a stranger 300 miles off." Nathan was quiet for a moment, turning a stray pebble over in his fingers before tossing it aside. "My mother used to say a house without a family in it was just a barn with better furniture," he said. "I watched her build something here out of nothing, out of hard years and harder winters, and I watched my father love her for it every single day until the fever took her. I wanted that. Not the version of it where a woman's just there to keep house and warm a bed. The real version. Somebody to build something with. And you thought a letter to a stranger was how you'd find that?" "I thought," he said slowly, "that most women I knew in town wanted a rancher's money more than they wanted a rancher's life. Wanted the name, not the work. I figured a woman willing to travel 300 miles on the strength of a few letters was a woman looking for something more honest than that. Wasn't sure what I'd find. Didn't expect—" He stopped himself. "Didn't expect what?" He looked at her, dirt-streaked and sun-warmed and more unguarded than she'd been in years, kneeling in a garden that was already somehow beginning to feel like it might belong to her. "Didn't expect to feel lucky," he said quietly, "on the very first morning." Clara's hands went still in the dirt. She didn't know how to answer, that didn't trust herself to try. So instead, she reached for another weed and pulled, and let the silence hold, the moment the way words might have broken it. By mid-afternoon, clouds had begun gathering pale and thin along the western ridge, and Nathan glanced at them with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent his whole life reading Wyoming sky. "Might get some weather tonight," he said. "Nothing serious. Summer storms come through quick and go quicker mostly." Mostly, he agreed with a small wry smile that didn't quite reach reassurance. "I'll have Ezra check the barn roof before supper just to be safe." They ate a simple meal that evening. Bread Clara had made herself that afternoon, the first thing she'd baked in a kitchen that wasn't a battlefield, and something in her chest swelled painfully proud when Nathan took a second slice without being asked, without comment, just quiet, genuine appreciation. "This is good," he said, and meant it plainly, the way he seemed to mean everything. "It's just bread. It's the best bread I've had since my mother's, and I'm not saying that to flatter you. I'm saying it because it's true, and you should know when a thing you've made is worth being proud of." Clara looked down at her plate, throat tight, unused to praise that didn't come wrapped in some later cost. Thomas had never once told her a meal was good, without following it days or weeks later, with some accounting of everything she owed him for the privilege of being fed and housed under his roof. She waited, some old animal part of her still bracing for the turn, the catch, the butt. It didn't come. Nathan simply finished his bread and asked her, easy as anything, what kind of flowers she might want to plant along the porch come spring. That night, the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters, and thunder rolled low and distant over the ridge. Clara lay in bed listening to it, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the sound of a storm outside didn't feel like a metaphor for anything waiting to happen inside. It was just weather. Just wind and rain moving across a wide, indifferent sky. And beneath it, a house that held no threat for her, and down the hall, a man who had already proven in one single day that his word was worth more than most men's oaths. She thought of her wrist still faintly marked beneath her sleeve. She thought of Thomas's voice thinner now, further away, like a storm that really might someday pass completely out of hearing. She thought of Nathan's face at the supper table saying, "That's the bravest thing I ever heard a person describe," and Ezra's easy laugh in the yard and the garden that was already impossibly starting to feel like something she'd choose to stay and tend. Clara Whitfield closed her eyes to the sound of rain against the roof, and for the second night in a row, she did not brace herself for what might come through the door. She simply slept, did not yet know that the peace she had found in one single day would soon be tested by a man from her past who still believed in his bones that she belonged to him and had never once learned to take no for an answer. The peace held for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of mornings that smelled like coffee of bread, rising on the windowsill of a garden, slowly coming back to life under Clara's careful hands. 3 weeks in which she stopped flinching every time Nathan moved too quickly, in which she learned the names of the horses, in which she caught herself humming once quietly, while she hung the wash and then stopped, startled because she couldn't remember the last time a song had risen out of her without permission. Then, on a Tuesday in late July, a letter arrived, and everything Clara had built began to crack. Nathan came in from town near sundown, with the mail tucked under one arm, and she knew the moment she saw his face that something was wrong. He wasn't a man whose expressions moved fast, but there was a stillness in him now, a careful blankness, the look of a man deciding how to hand a woman a thing he'd rather burn. "Clara," he said, "there's a letter here, addressed to you." Her hands went cold. "Nobody knows I'm here." "Somebody does." He set it on the table between them, face down, like even the handwriting was something he wanted to spare her. "Postmarks from back east, same county you came from, unless I'm reading it wrong." She didn't touch it. She stared at it the way a person stares at a snake coiled in the grass, the whole of her body gone rigid and small, and Nathan watched the change come over her, watched 3 weeks of slow, hard-won ease drain out of her face in the space of a breath. "You don't have to open it," he said quietly. "You don't have to read a single word he wrote. You don't know it's from him." "No." Nathan pulled out the chair across from her and sat slow, giving her the space to breathe. "But you do. I can see it on you." Clara's hand moved before her courage did. She turned the letter over, and the handwriting hit her like a fist, that cramped, controlling, backward slanting hand she would have known anywhere, the hand that had written her chores lists and her debts, and once a single line she'd never forgotten. "You are here because I allow it." Thomas Caldwell had found her. "How?" she whispered. "How could he possibly?" "Read it," Nathan said gently. "Or don't. But whatever's in there, you're not reading it alone. I'll sit right here." Her fingers shook as she broke the seal. The words swam and then sharpened, and she read them once, then again, and the second time, her breath caught and held somewhere behind her ribs. "He's coming," she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. He says a woman doesn't just leave. He says I have obligations, debts. He says he's already spoken to people about my instability. That's the word he uses. Instability. He says he's coming to collect what's owed and to make sure everyone here understands the kind of woman they've taken in." Nathan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "What's owed?" 6 years of room and board." Clara let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's what he called it. Every meal, every dress, every night under his roof after my parents died. He kept a ledger, Nathan, an actual ledger. He used to make me read it to him. All the ways I was in debt to him for the crime of being an orphan he never wanted." "That's not a debt," Nathan said. "That's a leash he built out of numbers. He'll make people believe it. That's what he does. Her hands were shaking harder now, the letter trembling in her grip. He's good with words. Better than me. He'll come into that town, and he'll be charming, and he'll be reasonable, and he'll tell them I'm sick in the head, that I ran off, that you've been taken in by a liar. And people will believe him because they already want to. You heard those women in the street? They already decided what kind of woman I am before I said a single word. Nathan reached across the table, slow, deliberate telegraphing every inch of the movement so she'd see it coming, and he did not touch her. But he set his hand flat on the wood beside hers, close enough that she could take it if she wanted, far enough that she didn't have to. Let him come, Nathan said. You don't understand what he is. I understand exactly what he is. I've known men like him my whole life. Men who never once raised a fist but ran their whole world on fear and called it order. His voice dropped quiet and certain. And I know something he's counting on you having forgotten. You're not that orphan anymore, Clara. You're not a girl with no name and no roof. You're a married woman on land that's got a lock on every door and 2 hands who'd walk through fire on my word. He's not coming to a house where you're alone. Not this time. Clara looked at him, and for a moment she wanted to believe. It wanted it so badly it frightened her. But belief had always been the thing that hurt her worst. You say that now, she said, barely above a whisper. But you don't know him. When he starts talking, when he gets that voice, you'll start to wonder. Everybody wonders. He'll make you wonder if maybe I did lie. Maybe I am unstable. Maybe I'm not worth the trouble. No. Nathan said it flat and final, no room in it for argument. I already know who you are. I've watched you for 3 weeks now. I've watched you flinch at a hand and then square your shoulders and keep going anyway. I've watched you bring a dead garden back to life. I've watched you laugh like you'd forgotten how and then remember. A man can talk pretty all he wants. He can't talk me out of what I've seen with my own eyes. Something broke loose in Clara's chest at that hot and sudden, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth to hold it in. Why? She managed. Why would you stand between me and a man who'll drag your name through the mud right alongside mine? You barely know me. This was supposed to be an arrangement, a name on paper. You could let him take me back and be rid of the whole mess by Sunday. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone rougher than she'd heard it. I told you about my sister, he said. Bit of it anyway, not all of it. He turned his hat over in his hands, staring at it like the answer was written on the brim. Her name was Ruth. She married a man from the next county over when she was 19. Charming fellow. Everybody liked him. And every time she came home with a mark on her, she had a reason for it. Fell off a horse, caught a door clumsy is all. And every time I wanted to believe her because believing her was easier than believing what was really happening under that man's roof. Clara's breath went shallow. Nathan? By the time I stopped believing the easy story, it was too late to do anything but bury her. His hands had gone white around the hat. 23 years old. They said it was a fall. Maybe it was. I'll never know for certain, and that not knowing is a thing I've carried every day since. So no, Clara. I'm not going to sit across from a woman who flinches at a hand reaching toward her and hand her back to the man who taught her to flinch and tell myself a comfortable lie about it. Not again. Not while I've got breath in me. The kitchen went silent, the only sound the wind picking up outside, and the low, distant grumble of a storm gathering somewhere past the ridge. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. About Ruth. So am I. Nathan set the hat down. But she's why I know a leash when I see one. And she's why I'm telling you plain Thomas Caldwell can come to Red Willow and say whatever he pleases. He is not taking you off this land. For a moment, Clara let herself lean into that. Let herself imagine that a man's word might be strong enough to hold back the thing that had been chasing her all her life. Then the old fear crept back in, cold and patient, and she gave voice to the thought that scared her most. And if the town takes his side, she asked, if he stands up in front of everyone and they decide he's the honest one and I'm the liar, what then? Nathan didn't answer right away. He was too honest to promise her something he couldn't guarantee. Then we deal with that when it comes, he said finally. But we deal with it together. That much I can promise you." The storm broke that night harder than the ones before, and Clara lay awake listening to it batter the shutters. And this time it did feel like a metaphor after all, like the past had finally caught up to the wide indifferent Wyoming sky and come to collect its due. Thomas Caldwell arrived 4 days later. Clara was in the garden when she heard the wagon on the road, and she knew before she saw him, knew the way. An animal knows a predator by the shift in the air, and she was on her feet with dirt on her hands and her heart slamming against her ribs before the man had even come into view. "Clara." Ezra's voice low and steady from the fence line. He'd seen her face. He was already moving. "You want me to fetch Nathan?" "He's in the north field," she said, and her voice came out thin. "He won't hear a wagon from there." "Tom." Ezra didn't raise his voice, but there was iron in it now. "Ride out and get the boss. Now." The young man was gone before the order finished, and Clara stood frozen at the edge of her garden as the wagon rolled up to the gate, and a man climbed down from it who looked to any stranger like nothing at all to fear. That was the terrible thing about Thomas Caldwell. He was ordinary. Neat gray suit, trimmed beard going silver at the edges, a kind, patient face, the kind of face people trusted on sight. He removed his hat as he approached, and he smiled at her warm as summer. And the sight of that smile turned Clara's stomach to ice, because she knew exactly what lived behind it. "There she is," Thomas said, gentle, sorrowful, like a man who'd finally found a lost and beloved child. "My Clara, do you have any idea how frantic I've been traveling all this way, not knowing if you were alive or dead in some ditch?" "Don't." Her voice shook. "Don't call me yours, after everything I did for you." He shook his head slowly, his eyes wet, and she marveled even now at how easily he could summon tears when they served him. "I took you in when you had no one, fed you, clothed you, kept a roof over your head for 6 years, and this is how you repay me, running off in the night. Do you know what people are saying, that I drove you to it? That I'm some kind of monster?" He pressed a hand to his chest. "It's broken my heart, Clara. Truly." Every word was a hook, and she felt them sink in. One by one, felt herself starting to shrink, starting to fold inward, the way she always had, the years of training, pulling her back down toward the small, frightened shape he'd made of her. "You need to leave," she said, but it came out smaller than she wanted. "Leave. I've come 300 miles to bring you home." He took a step closer, and Clara took a step back, and her heel caught the edge of the garden bed. "Look at you, dirt on your hands, playing at being a farm wife. This isn't you, Clara. You're not well. You know you're not well. The doctors back home said as much. All these fears you invent, these stories you tell yourself. I don't invent them." Her voice cracked. "I have the scars, Thomas. I know exactly where they came from. Scars." He said the word so gently, so sadly, that for one dizzying moment, even she almost doubted herself. "The mind is a fragile thing, my dear, especially a mind like yours. You've always had trouble telling what's real from what you fear. It's why you need someone to look after you. It's why you'll never manage out here on your own, no matter what fantasy this rancher sold you." And there it was, the thing Nathan had warned her about, the voice that made you wonder. Standing in her own garden on land, where she'd finally begun to breathe. Clara felt the old fog roll in, felt Thomas's certainty press against her own memory, until she couldn't tell which was heavier, and her mouth opened, and nothing came out, because he had trained her for 6 long years, that the safest thing she could ever do was disappear. "Miss Whitfield ain't going anywhere with you." Ezra had stepped up beside her, arms crossed, and his voice was flat and hard as a gravestone. He wasn't a large man, but there was something in the way he stood that made Thomas's smile flicker for just an instant. "And who might you be?" Thomas asked, recovering. "Man who works this land. Man who was told plain that this woman is the lady of this house and no one takes her off it." Ezra didn't move. "You'd best get back in your wagon." Thomas's face did something subtle then, a tightening around the eyes that Clara knew intimately, the look of a man unused to being told no. "I don't believe this concerns the hired help. This is a family matter." She ain't your family. Ezra's voice didn't rise. She's Nathan Cole's wife, and here comes Nathan Cole now. The sound of a horse at a hard gallop cut across the yard, and Clara turned to see Nathan riding in fast. Tom behind him, and the sight of him, the set of his shoulders, the plain fury held tight and controlled in his face, made something in her chest seize with a feeling she couldn't name, relief and terror and a fierce, unfamiliar hope, all tangled together. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, and he didn't run, but he crossed the yard in long, deliberate strides, and he put himself squarely between Clara and Thomas Caldwell, and only then did he speak. "You're on my land," Nathan said. "State your business and get off it." Thomas took his measure, the height, the calm, the quiet authority, and Clara watched him recalculate, watched him decide charm was the better weapon here than force. The kind face came back, the sorrowful eyes. "Mr. Cole, I presume. I'm Thomas Caldwell, Clara's guardian these 6 years past. I'm afraid you've been badly deceived, sir, and I've come a long way to spare you further trouble." He shook his head, all regret. "This poor girl. She's not well. Never has been. She spins these terrible stories, persecution, cruelty, imagined scars. And I fear she's convinced you of them, same as she nearly convinced the doctors back home. I don't blame you. She can be very persuasive when the fit is on her." Clara felt the words landing, felt them building their case brick by brick, and she waited, some cold, resigned part of her, waited for the doubt to creep into Nathan's face, for the wondering to begin. It didn't. "Interesting," Nathan said. "You keep talking about her scars like there's something she made up." "Imagined injuries. Yes. A common symptom of..." Then she imagined a bruise the exact shape of a man's grip around her wrist the day she stepped off that stagecoach. Nathan's voice was very quiet now, and somehow that was more frightening than shouting. "I saw it, Mr. Caldwell. With my own eyes. Fresh. Weeks old, some of them layered on top of each other like it happened more than once. A woman doesn't imagine a bruise into the perfect shape of the hand that made it." Thomas's smile held, but something behind it had gone brittle. "You saw what she wanted you to see." "No, I saw what she spent weeks trying to hide from me. There's a difference, and I know it because I watched her cover it up every single day like she was ashamed of it. Ashamed. Of what you did to her." Nathan took a single step forward. "That's not the behavior of a woman spinning a story. That's the behavior of a woman who was taught the marks were her fault." For the first time, Clara saw Thomas Caldwell falter. Just for a breath. Just a flicker. But she'd spent 6 years reading that face for the smallest changes, and she saw it, and it startled her more than anything else that day, because she had never not once seen him fail to talk his way into being believed. "This is absurd," Thomas said, and his voice had lost some of its silk. "I have documentation, medical records, a ledger of everything I spent supporting this ungrateful girl. The law is on my side, Cole, whether you like it or not. She has debts, legal obligations. Then we'll let the law sort out those debts," Nathan said, in front of a judge with those records laid out on a table where everyone can read them. "You want to make your case in a courtroom. Mr. Caldwell, you go right ahead. Sheriff's office is in town. Judge comes through every other Thursday." He tilted his head. "But something tells me a man with a case as strong as you claim wouldn't have ridden 300 miles to collect his obligation in person quiet-like, hoping to load her in a wagon before anybody official got wind of it. Men with the law truly on their side tend to let the law do the collecting." The silence that followed was total. Clara stared at Nathan and then at Thomas, and she watched something extraordinary happen. She watched the balance of a room tilt for the first time in her life, away from her tormentor and toward her. Thomas's mouth opened and closed. The kind face worked hunting for the right words. The reasonable tone, the story that would put him back in control. And for once, for the very first time in 6 years, the words didn't come fast enough. "You've made a mistake," Thomas said finally, and the warmth had drained entirely from his voice, now leaving something colder and truer underneath. "You have no idea what you've taken into your home. You'll see." She'll turn on you the way she turned on me. She'll invent some cruelty, and she'll run, and she'll leave you looking like the villain, and you'll wish you'd listened to me." "Maybe," Nathan said evenly. "But I'll take that risk over the alternative." "The alternative? Handing a frightened woman back to the man who frightened her." Nathan's voice never rose. "I did that once, Mr. Caldwell, with my own sister. I told myself the comfortable story, and I let her go back, and I buried her a year later. So you'll have to forgive me if I've lost my taste for taking a charming man's word over a bruised woman's fear." Thomas went still. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't that. Now! Nathan's tone shifted businesslike final. "You're going to get back in your wagon. You're going to ride into Red Willow, or you're going to ride clear out of this county, I don't much care which. And if you truly believe the law's on your side, you'll bring it back here in a uniform with papers, and we'll all have our say in front of a judge. But you set one boot on this land again without the sheriff beside you, and I'll have you for trespassing. That clear enough?" For a long taut moment, Clara thought Thomas might refuse. She saw the calculation moving behind his eyes. The search for another angle, another lever, another way to bend the situation back into a shape he controlled. Then, his gaze slid past Nathan to her, to Clara, standing straight now. Standing behind a man who hadn't wavered, flanked by two ranch hands, who hadn't moved. And something in that arithmetic finally came up short. "This isn't finished," Thomas said quietly. "No?" Nathan agreed. "I don't expect it is, but it's finished for today." Thomas Caldwell put his hat back on. He looked at Clara one last time, and the mask dropped away entirely. Then, just for her, just for a second, the kind face gone, and beneath it, the cold, possessive fury of a man who had never in his life been denied a thing he considered his. "You'll regret this," he said low enough that only she could hear it. And then, he climbed into his wagon and turned it around and drove back down the road he'd come, and Clara stood in her garden, with her legs shaking so hard she thought she might fall, watching the dust settle behind him. Nobody spoke until the wagon was gone from sight. "Clara!" Nathan turned to her, and all the hardness had left his face, leaving only worry. "You all right?" "Oh." She wasn't. She was trembling head to foot, and her breath was coming in short, ragged pulls, and the fog was still there. Thomas's voice still echoing. "You're not well. You invent these things. You'll never manage on your own," tangling with her own memory, until she couldn't tell up from down. "He almost had me," she whispered. "Standing right there. He almost made me believe it. That I imagined it. That I'm the one who's—" Her voice broke. "How does he do that? How does he stand there and lie and make it feel truer than what I lived through?" "Because he's had years of practice," Nathan said gently, "and because he needs you to doubt yourself. It's the only power he's got left. A man like that can't hold on to anything that isn't afraid of him. The second you stopped being afraid, you stopped being his. That's why he came. Not because he loves you. Because you got away, and men like him can't abide a thing they can't control walking free in the world." Clara pressed both hands to her face and breathed, and Ezra quietly put himself between her and the road, giving her something to stand behind. And Tom hovered awkwardly nearby, not knowing what to do with his hands, and slowly, slowly, the trembling began to ease. "You didn't wonder," she said finally, lowering her hands to look at Nathan. "The whole time he was talking, you never once wondered if he was right." "No. Everybody wonders. Everybody always—" "I already knew who you were." Nathan said simply the same thing he'd told her 4 nights before, and this time she felt the truth of it settle into her bones. "He can't take that from me. He can't talk me out of 3 weeks of watching you be brave. That's the thing about the truth, Clara. It doesn't need to be charming. It just needs somebody willing to look at it straight." Clara looked at this man, this quiet, stubborn, honorable man, who had lost a sister to a comfortable lie and sworn never to tell one again, and she felt something shift in her chest that had been locked tight for 6 long years. Not trust exactly. Trust was still too big a thing. but the door to it, which she'd bolted shut and buried the key of, had come open by a crack, and light was getting through. "He'll come back," she said. "With the sheriff, or with worse. He won't stop. That was never a lie, at least. He doesn't stop. Then we'll be ready when he does." Nathan held out his hand, slow, deliberate, telling her plainly with the motion that she could take it or leave it, that the choice was hers, the way every choice on this land was hers. "But right now, you're going to come inside, and you're going to sit down, and I'm going to make you a cup of coffee so bad it'll take your mind clean off your troubles. And we're going to figure out our next move together." "All right." Clara looked at his open hand. She thought of every hand that had ever reached for her in her life, and what they'd meant, and what they'd cost. And then she reached out, and she put her hand in his, and she did not flinch. Nathan's fingers closed around hers, warm and careful. And he didn't grip too hard, and he didn't pull, and he didn't make it into anything other than what it was, one person steadying another on unsteady ground. "That coffee had better be as bad as you promise," Clara said, and her voice only shook a little. "Ma'am," Nathan said, the corner of his mouth lifting. "I have never once disappointed a person's low expectations of my coffee." She almost laughed. It came out closer to a sob, but there was a laugh buried in it somewhere, and that was more than she'd have thought possible 10 minutes earlier, standing in the wreckage of a fear she'd carried across 300 miles, only to have it drive right up to her garden gate. They walked toward the house together, her hand still in his. Ezra and Tom falling into easy step behind, and Clara understood something then that she hadn't let herself understand before. Thomas Caldwell had come to remind her that she was alone, that she was owned, that she was a debt and a burden, and a woman too broken to stand on her own 2 feet. But she wasn't alone, not anymore. For the first time in her life, when the thing she feared most had walked right up to her door, there had been people standing between her and it who did not move. And whatever came next, the sheriff, the courtroom, the ledger with its cruel columns of numbers, Thomas's promise that this wasn't finished, she would not be facing it the way she'd faced everything else in her life. She would not be facing it alone. Inside, Nathan set the coffee to boil, and Clara sat at the table where 3 weeks ago she'd told a stranger the smallest piece of her story, and she found that her hands had finally stopped shaking. The fear was still there. It would be there a long time yet. But underneath it now was something new, something she was almost afraid to name in case naming it made it disappear. It felt, she thought, watching Nathan fumble with the coffee pot and mutter at it under his breath, an awful lot like the beginning of being safe. The coffee was, as promised, terrible. Clara drank 2 cups of it anyway, because the ritual of holding something warm steadied her, and because watching Nathan defend his own bad coffee gave her something to do besides listen for wagon wheels on the road. But Thomas Caldwell was not the kind of man who rode away and stayed away. Clara knew that better than anyone, and she was right. 6 days later, he made his first real move, and he did not make it against Clara. He made it against Nathan. It started small, the way Thomas's cruelties always did. A word here, a doubt there. He'd taken a room at the boarding house in Red Willow, and he did not hide. He went to church on Sunday and wept quietly and visibly in the back pew. He bought drinks at the saloon and told his sad story to anyone who'd listen. The poor sick girl he'd raised out of Christian charity. The ranchers who'd been deceived, his own broken heart. He was patient. He was reasonable. He never once raised his voice. And Red Willow, which had already decided what kind of woman Clara was, before she'd said a single word, began to listen. Clara learned about it from Mrs. Aldridge, the woman who came twice a week to help with the heavy chores. She arrived on a Thursday with her mouth set in a grim line, and she didn't so much as untie her bonnet before she said what she'd come to say. "You ought to know what's being said in town, Miss Whitfield." "I'd want to know if it were me." Clara's stomach dropped. "What's being said?" "That man, Caldwell." Mrs. Aldridge's voice was careful. "He's telling folks Nathan stole another man's ward, that he lured a sick young woman out west with lies, that there's something not right about a bachelor sending back east for a bride half his—" She stopped. "It's ugly is what it is, And some folks are believing it because it's more interesting than the truth, and because Nathan's always kept to himself, and people distrust a quiet man. Clara sank into a chair. This was the thing she had feared from the beginning. Not that Thomas would hurt her, but that he would hurt Nathan, that her past would reach out and stain the one good thing she'd found, that the kindest man she'd ever known would be dragged through the mud for the crime of showing her mercy. "He's turning them against Nathan," she said numbly. "Not me, Nathan." "Smart if you're a snake about it," Mrs. Aldridge said. "He can't make you go back by force, not with Nathan standing there, so he'll ruin the man instead. Make it so hard on him to keep you that maybe he lets you go just to have peace." She set a basket on the table. "I don't believe a word of it for what it's worth. I've known Nathan Cole since he was a boy in short pants, and there isn't a dishonest bone in him. But I'm one voice, and Caldwell's got a sad face and a full purse, and those two things buy a lot of listening." When Nathan came in from the fields that evening, Clara was waiting for him at the table, her hands folded tight in her lap. "You have to send me back," she said, before he'd even hung his hat. Nathan went very still. "Say that again." "He's ruining you, in town. Everything you've built here, your name, your standing. He's tearing it apart, and it's my fault, because I came here and brought him with me." Her voice was rising thin and desperate. "You didn't sign up for this. You wanted a wife to keep house, not a war with a man who'll spend the rest of his life making you pay for helping me. If you send me back, it stops. He gets what he wants, and he leaves you alone. That's how it works with him. He always gets what he wants eventually, and everyone around him just gets hurt in the meantime." "Are you finished?" Nathan asked quietly. "Nathan, because that has got to be the single dumbest thing I've heard come out of an otherwise sharp woman's mouth." Clara blinked. She'd braced for a lot of reactions. Not that one. Nathan hung his hat slow and deliberate, and pulled out the chair across from her, and sat and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and something much gentler underneath. "Let me make sure I've got this right," he said. "A man is spreading lies about me all over town, and your solution is to hand him the exact thing he wants so he'll stop. That's your plan. Reward the snake for biting. To protect you. I don't need protecting from gossip, Clara. I've lived in that town my whole life. I've weathered talk before, and I'll weather it again. Talk is cheap, and it's slow, and it burns itself out when there's nothing true underneath it to feed on." He leaned forward. "But you want to know the fastest way to make every word he's saying look like gospel truth. Send you back, load you into a wagon and hand you over. Because then everyone in Red Willow gets to say, 'See, Cole knew he was in the wrong all along. Why else would he give her up?' You wouldn't be saving my name. You'd be signing the confession he wants me to sign." Clara opened her mouth and closed it, because she couldn't find the flaw in what he'd said, and it terrified her a little how quickly he'd taken her fear apart. "He's counting on you doing exactly this." Nathan went on softer now. "He knows you. 6 years he knows how you think. He knows the surest way to get you back isn't to fight me. It's to make you believe that leaving is the noble thing, the selfless thing. He's not attacking me to hurt me, Clara. He's attacking me so you'll hand yourself back to him and call it kindness." The words hit her like cold water, because she recognized them the instant they were spoken. Recognized the shape of the trap she'd very nearly walked into, dressed up in the language of protecting someone she cared about. "Oh," she said faintly. "Oh, that's exactly what he's doing, isn't it?" "That's exactly what he's doing." Clara pressed her hands flat against the table. Something hardened in her small and new. "I almost did it. I sat here all afternoon working up the courage to leave, and I thought I was being brave, and really I was just doing the thing he trained you to do," Nathan finished. "Which is give up and call it virtue. It's all right. You've been running his gauntlet for 6 years. It's going to take more than 3 weeks to stop hearing his voice in your own head." He stood and moved toward the stove. "But you heard it that time. You caught it. That's the part that matters." That night, for the first time, Clara did not lie awake, bracing for the future. She lay awake, planning against it. And in the morning, when Nathan came down for breakfast, she was already at the table with paper and ink, her jaw set. "If he wants to fight this with the law," she said, "then we fight it with the law." He mentioned records, a ledger, Medical documents from doctors back home. Nathan. I want to write to those doctors. Nathan paused coffee halfway to his mouth. Go on. He said the doctors declared me unstable. But I remember those visits. I remember every one of them because I dreaded them for weeks each time. Her voice was steadier now, cold and clear, in a way it hadn't been in years. He'd bring me in and do all the talking. He'd describe my symptoms, my fearfulness, my strange stories, my hysteria. And the doctors would look at me, this quiet, frightened girl who wouldn't contradict the respectable man paying the bill, and they'd write down whatever he told them. She looked up. But there was one, Dr. Merriweather. He was old and he was kind, and once, just once, he sent Thomas out of the room and asked me alone if I was safe at home. And I was too afraid to answer, but he asked Nathan. He suspected. If he's still alive, if he still has his notes. Then his word carries weight a paid ledger never could. Nathan finished, and something lit behind his eyes. A physician who examined you and had his doubts about the man presenting you. That's not gossip, that's testimony. I don't know if he'll remember me. I don't know if he's even living. Clara's hand tightened on the pen. But it's the first time in 6 years I've thought of a single person who might take my side. And I want to write to him before I lose the nerve. They wrote the letter together that morning. Clara's words and Nathan's careful phrasing, and Tom rode it into town to catch the eastbound post. And for a few days, a fragile hope settled over the ranch, the hope of a woman who had spent her whole life without allies, discovering one at a time that she might have a few after all. Then Thomas escalated. The first sign was the fence. Ezra found it one morning, a long section of the south pasture line cut clean through in the night, and 11 head of cattle wandered loose across the road by the time they'd tracked them all down. Fence didn't cut itself, and no honest neighbor did it. Could be anybody, Nathan said, but his jaw was tight. Could be an accident. Weren't no accident, Ezra said flatly, holding up the severed wire. This was cut careful at night in the one spot furthest from the house. Somebody wanted us chasing cattle all morning instead of paying attention to something else. The something else revealed itself 2 days later. A man rode out to the ranch. Not Thomas, but a stranger, well-dressed, official-looking, with a leather satchel and a lawyer's careful smile. He introduced himself as Mr. Pembroke, attorney, retained by Mr. Thomas Caldwell of the Eastern County, and he had papers. A great many papers. Mr. Cole, Pembroke said smoothly, my client wishes to resolve this matter without unpleasantness. He's prepared a full accounting of the debts owed by Miss Whitfield room board medical care and sundry expenses over 6 years, totaling a considerable sum. He's also filed a petition asserting his continued guardianship on the grounds that Miss Whitfield was mentally unfit to enter into a marriage contract, rendering said marriage voidable. The smile never wavered. It's all quite legal, I assure you. My client is a thorough man. Clara felt the floor tilt. Voidable. He was going to unmake the marriage. He was going to declare her insane and undo the one legal shield she had. But Nathan didn't flinch. He took the papers and he read them slowly all the way through, while Pembroke waited with his patient lawyer's smile, and Clara watched Nathan's face and tried to breathe. This petition, Nathan said finally, rests entirely on Miss Whitfield being mentally unfit. That's the whole foundation of it. Take that away, and there's no guardianship to reinstate, and no marriage to void, and no debt a court would ever enforce against a grown woman for the crime of having been an orphan. That about the size of it, Mr. Pembroke? Pembroke's smile flickered just slightly. My client has documentation. Your client has a ledger he wrote himself and some doctor's notes he dictated the contents of. Nathan set the papers down on the table. I've got a physician back east being written to as we speak. Man who examined Miss Whitfield personally and by her account had grave doubts about the fellow presenting her. I've got 2 ranch hands who watched Caldwell drive up to my gate uninvited and try to load a frightened woman into a wagon before anyone official could witness it. And I've got my own eyes which saw the bruises your client says she imagined. He met the lawyer's gaze steadily. You want to take a petition built on her being unfit into a courtroom, Mr. Pembroke, you go ahead. But you'd best make sure your client's ready for what comes out when we get to put our witnesses on the stand too, because a voidable marriage claim swings both ways. If we prove she was sound of mind and he abused her, your client's not looking at a debt recovery. He's looking at charges." The lawyer's careful smile finally fully cracked. Clara watched it happen and could scarcely believe it. She had spent 6 years believing the law was a weapon that only ever pointed at her. And here was Nathan, calm as still water, turning it around in his hands and pointing it the other direction. Pembroke gathered his papers with slightly less composure than he'd arrived with. "I'll convey your position to my client," he said stiffly. "You do that," Nathan said. "And you convey this too while you're at it. The fence he had cut 2 nights back cost me a morning and could have cost me 11 head of cattle. He wants to play it legal. That's fine. We'll play it legal. But he sends somebody creeping onto my land again in the dark, and the next conversation won't be with a lawyer. It'll be with the sheriff, and it'll be about trespass and property damage, and I've got the cut wire to prove it. That clear?" "I'm sure I don't know anything about a fence," Pembroke said. "No," Nathan agreed. "I'm sure you don't." The lawyer rode off, and the moment his horse was gone from the yard, Clara turned to Nathan with her heart hammering. "He's going to lose in a courtroom," she said, and it came out half a question, like she didn't dare believe it. "You genuinely think a judge would actually—" "I think a man who abuses a woman and then invents an illness to keep controlling her does not hold up well under questioning," Nathan said. "And I think Caldwell knows it. That's why he cut the fence. That's why he's poisoning the town. That's why he sent a lawyer to threaten instead of just filing his petition and waiting for the judge. A man confident in his case doesn't need all that. He waits for Thursday and lets the court do its work. All this scrambling—" Nathan shook his head. "It's the scrambling of a man who knows that if this ever gets in front of an honest judge with witnesses on both sides, he loses everything. His reputation, his story, maybe his freedom. Then why do I still feel like he's winning?" Nathan's expression softened. "Because he spent 6 years teaching you that he always wins. That's the deepest cut he ever gave you, Clara. Not the bruises. The certainty. He made you believe down in your bones that no matter what you do, he ends up on top and you end up paying for it. And you can't unbelieve a thing like that in a few weeks just because a lawyer left looking rattled." He paused. "But he did leave looking rattled. You saw it same as I did. That happened. That was real." Clara held on to that. She held on to it through the following days as Thomas's campaign in town sputtered and shifted, as some folks who'd been listening to his sad story started to notice that the poor grieving guardian had also somehow retained a slick Eastern lawyer and been seen arguing with the man who cut Cole's fence. The tide didn't turn all at once, but it turned. And then 11 days after Clara wrote her letter, a reply came from the East, and it changed everything. Nathan brought it in from town, and this time his face wasn't careful and blank. This time there was something fierce and bright in it, and he set the letter down in front of Clara with a kind of controlled triumph. "Dr. Merriweather," he said. "He's alive. He remembered you." Clara's hands shook so badly she could barely open it. She read it once, and then her vision blurred, and she had to wipe her eyes and read it again to be sure she hadn't imagined the words. "He kept notes," she whispered. "All these years. He kept his own private notes separate from what Thomas dictated because he says here, he never once believed the guardian's account. He writes that he suspected mistreatment from the first visit. That he asked me alone if I was safe, and that my silence and my flinching told him more than any answer could have. That he lacked the standing to intervene at the time an unmarried orphan girl against a respected man, but that it troubled his conscience for years." She pressed the letter to her chest. "He says he'll testify. Nathan? He says he'll come out here himself if he has to, or send a sworn statement, whatever the court requires. He believed me. All this time there was somebody who believed me, and I never knew." Nathan sat down across from her, and for once he didn't have anything careful or measured to say. He just looked at her, at this woman who'd arrived on his ranch 3 weeks ago, convinced she was alone in the whole world, now holding proof in her trembling hands that she never quite had been. "You were never as alone as he needed you to think you were," Nathan said quietly. That was always the lie. The biggest one. Clara looked up from the letter, and something had changed in her face. Some final piece of the old fog burning away in the light of a single old doctor's decade-held conviction that a frightened girl had been telling the truth. "He's going to lose," she said. And this time, it wasn't a question, and it wasn't hope. It was the plain dawning certainty of a woman who had finally stopped bracing for the blow that never stopped coming. "Thomas is actually going to lose." "He is." Nathan reached across the table, and this time Clara met him halfway, her hand finding his without hesitation, without a flinch, without a single beat of the old fear. "But he's not going to go quiet, Clara. A man like that backed into a corner with everything he's built about to come apart. He's got one move left, and it's the ugliest one. When the law fails him, and the lies fail him, and the lawyer fails him, men like Thomas Caldwell stop being reasonable. They stop scheming." Clara's grip tightened on his hand. "You think he'll come here? Himself? One last time?" "I think," Nathan said slowly, "that a cornered man who's already cut my fence in the dark is a man building up to something worse. And I think we'd best be ready for the night he decides talking and lawyering aren't going to get him what he came for." Outside, the wind was beginning to rise again over the ridge the way it did before Wyoming. Weather turned mean, and Clara sat holding the hand of the man who had refused to send her back. Holding the letter from the one man who'd always believed her and understood that the storm she'd been running from her whole life was finally at last about to break. Not on her this time, but around her with people she trusted, standing at her side to meet it. Nathan was right. He was right about all of it. The night Thomas Caldwell decided that talking and lawyering wouldn't get him what he came for arrived exactly 9 days later, and it came as Nathan had guessed, on the back of a storm. The court date had been set for the following Thursday. Dr. Merriweather's sworn statement had arrived notarized and damning, and word of it had spread through Red Willow faster than Thomas's sad stories ever had. The tide that had begun to turn was now fully turned. Folks who'd wept along with the grieving guardian in the back pew now crossed the street to avoid him. The saloon that had poured his drinks and listened to his tales now went quiet when he walked in. A physician's decade-old conviction set down in careful ink had done what Clara's own word never could. It had made the town believe her. And Thomas Caldwell, cornered disgraced, with everything he'd built about to come apart in a courtroom 4 days out, made his last move. Clara woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment, half asleep, she thought she'd dreamed it, thought it was the old nightmare, the one where the house she couldn't escape was burning, and she was locked inside it. Then she came fully awake, and the smell was still there, thick and wrong, and beneath it a sound that turned her blood to ice, the frantic, terrified screaming of horses. "Nathan!" She was out of bed and into the hall before she'd finished shouting his name. "Nathan, the barn. I smell smoke, the horses." His door was already open. He was already up, already pulling on his boots, and one look at his face told her he'd smelled it too. "Stay in the house," he said, grabbing his rifle from beside the door. "Bolt it behind me. Don't come out for anything, you hear me? Anything." "Nathan! Bolt it, Clara!" And then he was gone out into the wind and the dark, and through the window she saw it, the orange glow rising from the barn flames, already climbing the dry timber, and the horses inside screaming to be let out. She did not bolt the door. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, her whole body shaking. Thomas's voice rising up in her, like it always did in moments of terror. "You're weak, you're useless, you'll only make it worse. Hide, disappear, take up less space." And then Clara Whitfield did the thing she had never once in 6 years been able to do. She told that voice to be quiet, and she ran out into the storm after him. The yard was chaos. Ezra was already there, and Tom, all 3 men hauling at the barn doors, and the heat rolled off the burning timber in waves. Nathan had a wet horse blanket over his shoulders and was shouting to be heard over the roar of it. "Clara, I told you to stay inside. There are 4 horses in there and 3 of you." Her voice cracked but held. "You need another set of hands and you know it. Tell me what to do." For half a second he stared at her. This woman who'd flinched at a hand reaching toward her, standing in a burning yard, refusing to hide, and then he made the only choice a practical man could make. "Wet blanket over your head, stay low, follow Ezra." He was already moving. "We get them out, and we get out. No horse is worth a life. You hear me? Nothing in that barn is worth your life." They went in. The smoke was blinding, the heat unbearable, and Clara's lungs screamed, but she followed Ezra to the nearest stall and threw the blanket over the panicked mare's eyes, the way he showed her, and together they hauled the animal out into the yard, where Tom took the lead. Then back in. Then again. 4 horses, 4 trips, each one worse than the last, as the fire climbed higher and the timber began to groan overhead. On the 4th trip, as Nathan led the last horse toward the doors, a beam gave way behind them with a crack like a rifle shot, and burning timber crashed down across the path they'd come in by. Clara heard Nathan shout, heard the horse scream, and for one horrifying second, she couldn't see him through the smoke. "Nathan!" She was on her knees, coughing blind. "Nathan, where?" "Here." A hand caught her arm. His hand, she knew it, instantly knew, the careful strength of it, even now, and he hauled her up and shoved her toward the far end, where a gap had opened in the burning wall. Go out the side, move." They stumbled out into the rain together, the last horse bolting free ahead of them, and collapsed in the mud, a safe distance from the inferno. Both of them coughing soot black and gasping, the barn behind them, fully engulfed now and past any saving. And that was when Clara saw him. Thomas Caldwell stood at the edge of the firelight at the far side of the yard, where the shadows met the glow, and he was watching the barn burn with an expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not rage, not even satisfaction. Something worse, a kind of calm, righteous certainty, the look of a man who believed he was simply setting the world back to rights. "You did this?" Clara said. She was on her feet without deciding to stand. "You set the fire. I gave you every chance." Thomas's voice was almost gentle, almost sorrowful, cutting through the roar of the flames. "I came all this way. I asked you nicely. I offered to take you home, to forgive the debt, to forget this whole ugly business. And you chose this instead. You chose him." He shook his head slowly. "So if it burns, Clara, that's on you. Everything that happens now is on you. It always was. You just never could accept your part in it." Nathan started forward, and Clara saw murder in his face for the first time since she'd known him. Saw the calm break, but she caught his arm. "No," she said. "Not like that. He wants you to. He wants you to hit him so he can play the victim one more time. Don't give it to him." Nathan stopped. His whole body was rigid, his hands shaking with the effort of not moving, and he looked at her, and something passed between them. "He's right there," Nathan said low. "He burned my barn. He could have killed you. He's standing right there." "I know." Clara didn't take her eyes off Thomas. "But this is exactly what he does. He pushes and pushes until you break, and then he points at the broken thing and says, 'See? I told you they were dangerous.' I've watched him do it 100 times. He turns your anger into his innocence." She raised her voice, and it did not shake. "That's what you do, isn't it, Thomas? You make people so afraid, so angry, so desperate, and then when they finally react, you stand back with clean hands and say, 'Look what they did.' You've never once in your life owned a single thing you've done." For the first time, something in Thomas's calm certainty flickered. "You don't speak to me that way," he said. "I'll speak to you however I please." Clara stepped forward out of Nathan's shadow into the firelight, and she was trembling head to foot, but she did not stop. "You know what I finally understand standing here? You're not powerful. You never were. You're a small, frightened man who could only ever feel big by making a girl feel smaller. And the second I stopped feeling small, you had nothing. That's why you're here. That's why you cut the fence and hired the lawyer and lit that barn. Not because you own me, because you can't stand that you don't. Be quiet, Thomas hissed, and there it was, the mask fully gone now. The reasonable sorrow burned away, and underneath it, the ugly sputtering fury of a man watching his last hold on someone slip through his fingers. No! Clara's voice rang out clear over the fire. I spent 6 years being quiet. I'm done being quiet. You want to know the truth, Thomas? The one you've spent all this time and money trying to bury? You hurt me. For 6 years you hurt me, and you told me it was my fault, and you made me believe there was something wrong with me, so I'd never dare tell a living soul. And it worked. It worked for a long, long time. Her voice broke, but she pushed through it. But it doesn't work anymore. Because I told him, and he believed me, and that doctor believed me. And come Thursday, a judge is going to hear all of it, and there is not one thing you can burn down that'll change what's already been written and sworn. Thomas's hand moved toward his coat. Ezra's rifle came up before it got there. I wouldn't, Ezra said quietly, and there was nothing gentle in his voice now. Whatever you've got in that coat, mister, you leave it right where it is. Tom's already ridden for the sheriff. You cut a fence, we could have argued that. You burned a barn with people inside it. He shook his head slowly. That's the kind of thing they hang a man for out here. So you just stand real still and wait for the law you're so fond of. The word hung in the firelight. Hang. And Clara watched the full weight of what he'd done finally land on Thomas Caldwell. Watched him understand at last that he had overplayed his hand catastrophically. That in his fury at losing her, he'd committed a crime no lawyer could talk him out of. No sad story could soften. No ledger could balance. Arson. Attempted murder. Some would call it, with 3 people inside that barn. He had come west to reclaim his property, and instead, he had put a noose around his own neck. You planned this all wrong, Clara said softly, almost with wonder. You always plan everything so carefully. But you couldn't stand to lose, and it made you stupid. You finally did something even you can't talk your way out of. Thomas looked at her, and for one moment the two of them simply stared at each other across 6 years and 300 miles, and a burning barn, and Clara saw in his eyes the exact instant he realized he had lost not the argument, not the court case, but everything, completely and forever. He ran. He bolted for the horse he'd left tethered at the tree line, and Nathan started after him, but Ezra's voice stopped them both. Let him run. Man on a lathered horse in a storm, sheriff already coming, he won't get 10 miles. And if he does, he's a fugitive now, not a respectable guardian. His name's worth nothing the second that sheriff hears what happened here. Ezra lowered the rifle. Chasing him in the dark just gets one of us hurt for nothing. Let the law have him. Nathan stopped. His chest was heaving, soot-streaked rain running down his face, and he turned back to Clara and crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and took her by the shoulders, gently, always gently, even now, even soaked and furious and half-choked with smoke. Are you hurt, Clara? Look at me. Are you burned? Are you? I'm all right. She was crying and laughing at once, shaking apart in his hands. I'm all right, I'm all right. Are you? That beam, I thought. I'm fine. I'm fine. And then, because there didn't seem to be anything else to do, because they had just walked through fire together and come out the other side. Nathan pulled her against his chest and held her, and Clara pressed her face into his soaked shirt and let herself be held for the first time in her adult life without a single ounce of fear. The barn burned to its frame behind them. The rain coming harder now kept the fire from spreading to the house or the fields, and in the end, that was the only mercy of the weather. Thomas had lit his fire in a storm, and the storm that was meant to cover his crime instead contained it. The sheriff arrived near dawn, Tom leading him up the road, and by then the fire had burned itself down to smoking timber, and the whole exhausted lot of them were sitting on the porch wrapped in blankets. Nathan told it plain, the threats, the lawyer, the cut fence, and now this. Ezra and Tom bore witness, and Clara, sitting in a rocking chair with a blanket around her shoulders, and Nathan standing at her side with one hand resting on the chair back, told the sheriff the whole of it start to finish in a voice that did not once waver. 6 years laid out in the gray morning light. The guardianship that was really a cage. The ledger of manufactured debts. The doctors fed lies. The one who suspected the truth and kept his notes. The letters. The lawyer. The fire. The sheriff. A weathered man named Dobbs, who'd known Nathan 20 years, listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I've got to tell you, we don't often hear a story that lays out this clean. Usually these things are one person's word against another's, and a man like you described respectable, well-spoken, usually he skates because there's nothing but a frightened woman's say-so against him." He turned his hat in his hands. "But he burned a barn with folks inside it in front of 3 witnesses, and there's a sworn statement from a physician sitting in the county courthouse right now that backs every word you've said. That's not one person's say-so anymore. That's a case. That's the kind of case that puts a man away for a long, long time if the fire didn't already earn him worse." Clara felt something she had never felt in the presence of the law before. She felt believed. "You'll find him?" she asked. "Ma'am, he's a stranger on a stolen horse who set a fire in coal country. Every rancher between here and the territory line will know his description by noon." Dobbs stood settling his hat back on. "He'll turn up. They always do. And when he does, he's not walking back into a courtroom as a grieving guardian. He's walking in as an arsonist. Whole different conversation." He nodded to Nathan. "I'll want statements from all of you proper down at the office. But that can wait till you've all had some rest and some water. You did right letting him run instead of chasing him into the dark. Wouldn't have wanted to be pulling one of you out of a ditch this morning, too." He rode off, and the ranch went quiet at last, and the 4 of them sat on the porch in the gray light and the drizzle, too exhausted, and too wrung out to speak, watching the last of the smoke rise from the ruin of the barn. It was Tom who broke the silence, young and blunt and honest. "Ma'am," he said, "if you don't mind my saying, that was about the bravest thing I ever saw. You standing there telling him off with the whole barn going up. I'd have run. I damn near did run." "Language, Tom," Ezra said mildly. "Sorry, ma'am." Clara found to her surprise that she could laugh, a small, cracked, exhausted laugh, but a real one. "I wanted to run," she admitted. "Every second of it, I wanted to run. I've wanted to run my whole life." She looked out at the smoking timber, and then at Nathan beside her. "But I finally had somewhere worth standing my ground." Nathan's hand, still resting on the back of her chair, shifted, and his fingers found her shoulder, and he squeezed once gently and said nothing at all, because there wasn't anything he needed to say. They found Thomas Caldwell 2 days later. He hadn't made it out of the county. Ezra had been right. A man on a lathered horse in a storm with every rancher in the territory watching for him didn't get far. A cattle crew found him holed up in an abandoned line shack 12 miles north, out of food, out of luck, out of the careful respectability that had protected him his whole life. He tried to tell them his sad story. It didn't work anymore. His name, as Ezra had promised, was worth nothing. Sheriff Dobbs brought word to the ranch himself. "He's in the county jail," Dobbs said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hand. "And he'll stay there. Arson for certain. The prosecutors talking attempted murder, given there were 3 of you in that barn. And with the doctor's statement and everything Miss Whitfield laid out, they're looking hard at charges going back years for what he did to her under the color of guardianship." He looked at Clara. "I won't lie to you, ma'am. There'll be a trial. You'll likely have to testify, tell it all again in front of him, and a courtroom full of strangers. That won't be easy. A thing like that never is." Clara felt the old fear stir the thought of facing him again, of saying it all aloud in a room where he sat watching, and she waited for it to fold her up small the way it always had. It didn't. "I'll testify," she said, "as many times as it takes. I spent 6 years too afraid to say a single word against him." She lifted her chin. "I think I can manage to say them in a courtroom where he can't do a thing about it." Dobbs looked at her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his weathered face. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I expect you can." When the sheriff had gone, Clara stood in the yard looking at the black skeleton of the burned barn, and Nathan came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. "I keep waiting to feel afraid," she said finally. He's in jail. He's going to trial. He's going to lose everything, and it's going to be my words that do it. And I keep waiting to feel that old fear, the one that says he'll find a way. He always finds a way. He'll make me pay for this somehow. She turned to look at Nathan. But it isn't coming. For the first time, I look at what's ahead, and I'm not afraid of it. I'm just ready for it. That's not because the fear's gone, Nathan said gently. The fear doesn't ever really go, not all the way. Something like what you lived through it leaves its marks under the skin, the same as it leaves them on top. He looked at her. But you're not standing alone in front of it anymore, feeling like you've got to be small enough to survive it. That's the difference. You ran into a burning barn, Clara. You told a man who terrified you for 6 years exactly what he was to his face with the whole place going up around you. Whatever he broke in you, it's mending. I've watched it mend a little more every single day since you got here. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand, deliberately easily, the way she'd once thought she'd never be able to take anyone's hand again. We're going to need a new barn, she said. Nathan huffed out something that was almost a laugh. We are. Before winter. Before winter, he agreed. Then I suppose, Clara said, and there was something in her voice he hadn't heard before, something steady and warm and unafraid. We'd best start rebuilding. She said we, not you, not I'll leave you to it. We. And Nathan Cole, who had lost a sister to a comfortable lie and sent for a stranger, out of a loneliness he'd never quite named, looked at the woman standing beside him in the ashes of the worst night either of them had lived through, and understood that somewhere in the fire, and the fear, and the standing of her ground, the arrangement they'd made on paper had quietly become something neither of them had dared to plan for. They walked back toward the house together, hand in hand, past the smoking ruin of the barn that would be rebuilt before the first snow, and behind them the sun finally broke through the last of the storm clouds and spilled gold across the wet Wyoming grass, and Clara Whitfield walked into it without once looking back over her shoulder to see what might be coming for her. There was nothing coming for her anymore. For the first time in her life, the only thing ahead of her was the life she was choosing to build. The trial came in the fall, when the aspens along the ridge had gone to gold, and the new barn stood raised and fresh timbered where the burned one had been. Clara had not slept well the night before. She lay awake in the dark of her room, still, her own room, still with its lock, though she no longer turned the key and listened to the wind move through the eaves and let the fear come, because she had learned in these months that fighting the fear only made it stronger. Better to let it in, sit with it, and go on anyway. Near midnight, she heard Nathan's footsteps pause outside her door the way they had that first night. You awake? He asked quietly. I am. A pause. You don't have to do this, Clara. There's enough without your testimony. The doctor's statement, the fire, the witnesses. Dobbs said as much. You could let the others carry it. I know. She stared at the ceiling. But if I let them carry it, then some part of me will always believe I couldn't, that I was too weak to say it to his face. Her voice was steady in the dark. I've spent 6 years being the woman who couldn't. I'd rather find out I'm the woman who can. Another pause, longer this time. Then softly, you are. I already know it. But I understand needing to know it for yourself. She heard him start to move away, and then she said before she'd quite decided to, Nathan, will you be there in the room, where I can see you? Clara. His voice came warm through the door. You couldn't keep me out of that room with a team of horses. I'll be in the front row. You look up any time you need to, and I'll be right there looking back. She slept after that. Not well, but she slept. The courthouse in Red Willow was a plain building, and by the time they arrived, it was fuller than Clara had expected, and her stomach clenched at the sight of all those faces, until she began to recognize them. Mrs. Aldridge sitting near the front with her chin set. Ezra and Tom in their Sunday clothes, scrubbed and uncomfortable, and there. Half the ranchers in the county. And to her astonishment, the sharp-faced woman from the mercantile Mrs. Higgins, who'd whispered about her that first day in the street, sitting stiff-backed with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. They had come. Not to gawk, to stand witness. Thomas Caldwell was already at the defendant's table when they brought Clara in, and the sight of him nearly undid her. He looked smaller. That was the first thing she noticed. The neat gray suit was gone, replaced by the rough clothes of a man who'd spent weeks in a county cell, and the careful, patient, respectable face had a hunted quality to it now, a fraying at the edges. But when he turned and found her across the room, the eyes were the same cold and possessive and certain. And for one terrible moment, Clara felt herself start to shrink, felt 6 years of training pull at her like a current, felt the old voice rise up. Sit down. Be small. Be quiet. You'll only make it worse. Then she looked to the front row. Nathan was there, exactly where he'd promised. And when her eyes found his, he didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't do anything so large it would draw notice. He simply held her gaze, steady as bedrock. And in it, she read everything he'd told her through a locked door the night before. I'm right here. Look up anytime you need to. Clara stopped shrinking. She lifted her chin, and she walked to her seat, and she did not look at Thomas Caldwell again until she was made to. The prosecutor was a young man named Hartley Sharp, and thorough, and he laid the case out brick by brick the way Nathan had laid out his defense in the kitchen months before. The fire came first. Ezra's testimony and Tom's plain and damning 3 people in a burning barn and a man standing at the tree line watching it go up. Then the cut fence, then the lawyer's threats. Then, when the ground had been prepared, Dr. Merriweather's sworn statement read aloud into the silent courtroom. Clara had read it a dozen times, but hearing it spoken in that room in front of all those people in front of Thomas himself was something else entirely. The old physician's careful words, his decade-old suspicion, his account of sending Thomas from the examination room and asking a frightened girl alone if she was safe, and of the silence and the flinch that had answered him more clearly than any words. His shame at lacking the standing to act. His conviction held all these years that Thomas Caldwell had been abusing his ward under the cover of Christian charity. When Hartley finished reading, the courtroom was so quiet, Clara could hear the wind against the windows. Then they called her to testify. The walk to the stand was the longest of her life. Longer than the walk off the stagecoach that first day. Longer than the walk into the burning barn. She could feel every eye in the room on her, could feel Thomas's gaze like a hand at her throat, and with every step, the old voice screamed at her to turn, to flee, to disappear. She sat down. She looked up. Nathan was there, and Clara Whitfield told the truth. She told all of it in a voice that started small and grew sentence by sentence into something she didn't recognize as her own, steady, clear, unbroken. She told them about her parents' death and the guardian who'd taken her in and called it charity while building a cage. She told them about the ledger, the endless accounting of debts she could never repay. The way he'd made her read the columns aloud, so she'd understand exactly how much she owed him for the crime of existing. She told them about the room she'd learned to stay out of the flinch. She'd learned to hide the way he'd taught her that her fear was an insult to him and her pain was her own fault. And then, because Hartley asked her to, she told them about the bruises. There were scars under my sleeves the day I arrived here, she said, and her voice did not waver. I'd covered them for weeks. I'd learned to cover them. I thought if anyone saw, they'd think what he always told me. They'd think that I was damaged, that I'd earned it somehow, that a woman with marks like that must have done something to deserve them. She looked out at the courtroom and then deliberately at Thomas. That's the cruelest thing he did. Worse than the bruises. He made me believe they were my shame to carry. He made me hide the proof of what he'd done as though I were the guilty one. And what changed that? Hartley asked quietly. Clara's eyes found Nathan in the front row. A man asked me a question, she said. The night he saw the scars, the night a storm tore my sleeve and there was no more hiding them. He didn't look at me with disgust. He didn't ask what I'd done to deserve them. He looked at me with sadness and he asked, Clara, who did this to you? Her voice thickened, but she held it. In 6 years, no one had ever asked me that. Everyone always asked what was wrong with me. He was the first person who understood that the right question wasn't what's wrong with her. It was who hurt her. And the answer to that question is sitting right there. She lifted her hand and pointed at Thomas Caldwell. And she did not look away. And for the first time in 6 years, she watched him flinch instead of her. The defense tried, of course. Thomas had money still somewhere, and it had bought him a lawyer, not the smooth Mr. Pembroke who had vanished the moment arson entered the picture, but a local man doing his grim duty. He tried the old story. Unstable. Hysterical. A troubled girl who invented cruelties. He put the questions to Clara sharp and fast, trying to rattle her, trying to summon the frightened silence that had served Thomas so well for so many years. It didn't come. You claim you were mistreated, the lawyer pressed, yet you never once reported it. Never told a soul. Never sought help in 6 long years. Why should this court believe such abuse occurred when you yourself stayed silent about it? And Clara, who 6 months ago would have crumbled under exactly that question, looked at him and answered in a voice like cold, clear water. You've never been truly afraid of someone, have you, sir? She said. Because if you had, you wouldn't ask that. When you're that afraid of a person, when they control your food, your shelter, whether you sleep safe or don't, you don't report them. You survive them. You make yourself small and quiet and useful, and you get through one more day and one more, and you tell yourself, that's just how the world is, because they've made sure you can't imagine it being any different. She held his gaze. My silence isn't proof it didn't happen. My silence is the loudest proof there is of exactly how it happened. He didn't need locks. He built the cage inside my own head. And the fact that I'm sitting here now, saying all of this out loud in front of you and God, and this whole room, that's not evidence. I was never afraid. That's evidence that somebody finally showed me I didn't have to be anymore. The lawyer had no follow-up. He sat down. The jury was out for less than an hour. Clara sat in the front row beside Nathan while they waited, her hands folded in her lap. And Nathan didn't reach for them, or crowd her, or fill the silence with reassurances. He just sat beside her solid and present, and when the trembling started in her hands, he set his own hand flat on the bench between them, palm up an offer and not a demand exactly as he'd done 100 times before. She put her hand in his without hesitating. Whatever they say, Nathan murmured low enough for only her, you already won. You understand that the verdict's just paperwork now. The winning already happened up on that stand when you pointed at him and didn't look away. Nothing they read out changes that. I know, Clara whispered, and found that she meant it. But I'd like the paperwork too. She got the paperwork. Guilty. On the arson. On the reckless endangerment of 3 lives. And in a thing the prosecutor said afterward, he'd rarely seen guilty on the older charges. 2, the years of abuse under color of guardianship, because a physician's decade-held conviction and a woman's unbreakable testimony and a barn burned down out of pure possessive spite had together been enough to make 12 ordinary men believe a frightened woman's word over a respectable man's story. They led Thomas Caldwell out in irons. He looked at Clara as they passed one last time, and she made herself meet it, not out of defiance now, but out of a need to see it finished, to watch the door close on the thing that had chased her across 300 miles and 6 years of her life. Whatever he saw in her face, it was not the girl he'd made. There was nothing of that girl left for him to recognize. And she watched something in him finally fully break at the understanding that she was gone, that the frightened creature he'd owned had died somewhere on a Wyoming ranch and been replaced by a woman he had no power over at all. Then he was gone through the door, and Clara Whitfield sat in the courthouse of a town that had once whispered about her in the street, surrounded by people who had come to stand witness for her, holding the hand of a man who had refused 100 times to let her go. And she began quietly to weep, not from grief and not from fear, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of being at last free. The months that followed were not a fairy tale, and Clara would have distrusted them if they had been. Freedom, she learned, was not a door you walked through once. It was a thing you had to keep choosing over and over in 100 small moments a day. The fear did not vanish with the verdict. Some nights, she still woke gasping from dreams of locked rooms and cold ledgers, still heard Thomas's voice in the quiet hours, telling her she was worthless, that she'd never managed, that she'd invented her own suffering. Some mornings, a sudden movement, or a raised voice, still sent her flinching before her mind could catch up to tell her body it was safe. But Nathan never rushed her. That was the thing she came to understand about him, the thing that mattered more than all his defending and all his standing between her and the world. He understood that trust was not built with grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It was built with 10,000 small, ordinary, repeated acts of gentleness laid down day after day like fence posts, until one day you looked up and realized they'd fenced in something worth protecting. A cup of coffee still terrible waiting for her on the mornings after the bad dreams, no questions asked about why her eyes were red. A hand offered palm up on the bench between them, always an offer, never a demand. A step to the side at the stove, giving her more room, adjusting himself around her comfort without ever making a show of it. A door closed softly down the hall each night, never slammed, never a statement. Just the quiet sound of a man who understood that safety for her meant the absolute certainty that no one was coming. And slowly, so slowly, she couldn't have named the day it happened, Clara stopped flinching. She noticed it first with the horses. She'd taken to helping with them in the new barn that smelled of fresh timber, and one afternoon Nathan came up behind her while she was brushing down the bay mare and set a hand on her shoulder to get her attention, and she didn't jump, didn't tense, didn't feel her body brace for a blow. She simply turned, and there he was, and it was only him, and it had only ever been going to be him. She stared at him for a long moment, something dawning in her face. "What?" Nathan asked. "What is it?" "You touched me," she said slowly, "and I wasn't afraid." Nathan went very still, and then something moved across his face, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a kind of quiet, aching tenderness, the look of a man watching something he'd tended patiently for a long time, finally unmistakably bloom. "No," he said softly, "you weren't." Clara laughed, surprised, delighted, a little tearful, and did the thing she'd never once initiated in her life. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and held on, pressed her face against his chest, and felt his arms come around her slow and careful. And she was not afraid. She was not afraid. For the first time in her adult life, a man's arms around her meant nothing but safety and warmth and the steady beat of a heart that had refused again and again to give up on her. "I didn't fall in love with the woman who needed saving," Nathan said into her hair, his voice rough. "I want you to know that. I didn't fall for a woman who was helpless or fragile or broken. I fell in love with the woman who ran into a burning barn when I told her to hide, who stood in a courtroom and pointed at the man who terrified her and didn't look away. I fell in love with the woman who survived." Clara pulled back just far enough to look up at him, and there were tears on her face, but she was smiling, smiling the way she'd once forgotten how to smile. "Say it again," she whispered. "Which part?" "The part where you love me." Nathan smiled, that small, rare smile that transformed his whole weathered face, and cupped her cheek in his rough hand, gentle as he'd always been, and said, "I love you, Clara Whitfield. Have for a while now. Wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. Wasn't sure I had the right to say it, given how we started." "How we started," Clara repeated, and something in her chest ached at the memory of that frightened woman stepping off the stagecoach, yanking her sleeve down over a bruise. "We started with a lie, didn't we? A name on paper, an arrangement. We started with you not trusting a single word I said, and you were right not to. You didn't know me from Adam." Nathan's thumb traced her cheekbone. "But we didn't stay there. That's the part that matters. We didn't stay there." "No," Clara said, and she reached up and covered his hand with her own, pressing it to her cheek. "We didn't." And then, because there was nothing left standing between them, no fear, no ledger, no cage, no man watching from the tree line, Clara Whitfield rose up on her toes and kissed her husband. And it was the first kiss she had ever given freely. The first touch in her whole life she had chosen entirely for herself and Nathan Cole. Kissed her back, like a man who understood exactly what it had cost her to close that distance and exactly what it was worth. They were married again in the spring. Not on paper this time, they were already married on paper, had been from the start. This time, they stood up in front of the whole town of Red Willow, in the little church where Thomas had once wept his crocodile tears in the back pew, and they said the words to each other, and meant them every one chosen and not arranged. Mrs. Aldridge cried. Ezra gave the bride away, gruff and proud and uncomfortable in a collar, and admitted afterward that he'd have shot anyone who tried to stop the wedding, which everyone agreed was as fine a blessing as any father could give. Even Mrs. Higgins came and pressed Clara's hand at the door and said in a voice stiff with the effort of it, "I judged you wrong the day you arrived, in the street. I'm ashamed of it. You're the finest woman this town's taken in all my years, and I'd be honored if you'd let me tell folks I said so." Clara, who 6 months earlier could not have imagined the sharp-faced woman from the mercantile ever saying a kind word to her, took her hand and said, "I'd be glad to be your friend, Mrs. Higgins. We all judge from fear sometimes. I know that better than most. What matters is what we do when we learn we were wrong." And she meant it, and Mrs. Higgins wept a little, and that was the end of the whispering in the street forever. The years that came after were good years. Not perfect years. Clara had lived too long in the shadow of a man who traded in false perfection to ever again mistake a real life for a flawless one. There were hard winters. There were seasons the cattle prices fell, and they lay awake worrying over the ledgers. Honest ledgers now full of true numbers instead of a tyrant's invented debts. There were arguments because they were two stubborn people, and stubborn people quarrel, and Clara found to her wonder that she could disagree with her husband, could raise her voice, could stand her ground, could be angry at him, and he would only listen and argue back and never once make her afraid. That, more than anything, was how she finally understood she was truly free. Not that they never fought. That fighting had stopped meaning danger. The coal ranch prospered. It grew from 200 head to 5, then more. The land Nathan had once said he didn't know what to do with filled up with cattle and crops and the ordinary bustle of a working home. But when folks asked Nathan in later years what he was proudest of, the fine herd, the good land, the money in the bank, he'd shake his head at all of it. None of that, he'd say. "I'm proudest of the sound of her laughing. There was a time I thought she'd forgotten how. Every laugh I've heard out of that woman since I counted a fortune worth more than the whole spread." And Clara laughed often in those years. The garden she'd brought back to life the first week grew famous in the county. Folks came from 3 towns over to buy her preserves and beg her advice on their tomatoes. She kept the books, and kept them well, and Ezra never once let anyone forget he'd predicted it. And she became, over the years, something she could never have imagined that frightened day on the stagecoach, a woman other women came to. Because word got around the way it does in small towns of what Clara Whitfield had survived and how she'd survived it. And every so often, a woman would come to the ranch, sometimes a stranger who'd traveled a long way, sometimes a neighbor Clara had known for years without ever guessing, and she'd come with the same careful stillness Clara remembered in herself, the same practiced smile, the same way of protecting one side of her body, the same flinch. And Clara would take her into the kitchen and pour her a cup of coffee and say the words no one had said to her for 6 long years. "You don't have to earn kindness here, and whatever was done to you, it was never your shame to carry. The shame belongs to the one who did it." She helped more women than she ever kept count of. Some she gave money. Some she gave a place to stay until they got their feet under them. Some she simply gave the thing that had saved her own life, the radical, unfamiliar experience of being believed. Of having someone look at their fear and understand that the right question was never what's wrong with her, but who hurt her. Nathan built onto the house over the years to make room for them, the women passing through, and never once complained about the expense, and more than once said it was the best money the ranch ever spent. They never had children of their own. It was the one sorrow of those good years, a quiet grief they carried together and spoke of rarely. But their house was never empty, never the barn with better furniture Nathan's mother had warned against. It was always full of the women Clara helped of Ezra and Tom, who became less like hands and more like family, of the whole warm bustle of a life built on purpose out of the wreckage of two lonely people's pasts. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the house had gone still, Nathan and Clara would sit together on the porch and watch the sun go down over the fields they'd built into something lasting. It was on one such evening, many years on, that Nathan asked her the question. "Do you ever think about it?" he said. "The day you arrived here." Clara was quiet for a while, watching the light go gold and then red across the grass. Her hair had silvered at the temples by then, and the hands folded in her lap were a working woman's hands, strong and sure hands that had pulled weeds and turned pages and held a dozen frightened women steady while they wept. But her eyes, when she turned them on her husband, were the same eyes that had looked out at Red Willow that first terrified day, only without a trace left of the fear. "I think about it often," she said. "I think about the woman who stepped off that stagecoach, so afraid, so sure that safety was a word men used before they took something from you." She reached over and found his hand the way she had 10,000 times by then, easy and unafraid. I think about how she yanked her sleeve down over that bruise and forced a smile and got ready to survive one more man. And I want to tell her. I want to reach back through all these years and tell her, hold on. Just hold on. The longest journey of your life isn't the one you're on right now. "No," Nathan said softly, though he knew the answer. He'd heard her say it before. He never tired of hearing it. No. Clara looked out at the home they'd built at the fields, and the barn, and the porch, worn smooth by years of their sitting, and she smiled. The journey from Ohio to Wyoming was 300 miles. That was the easy one. Her voice was steady and full and sure. The long journey, the one that took years, the one that nearly killed me a dozen times over, that was the journey from being afraid all the time to believing finally all the way down that I was worthy of being loved. Nathan brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. "And do you?" he asked. "Believe it all the way down?" Clara Whitfield looked at the man who had asked her on the worst day of her life, the one question that had changed everything. Who did this to you, and who had spent every day since teaching her patiently, stubbornly, without ever once rushing her? That the answer to that question said nothing about her worth and everything about the cruelty of another. She looked at him, and there was no flinch in her, no fear, no ghost of the frightened girl she'd been. "Yes," she said, "all the way down." The scars beneath her sleeves had faded to almost nothing. Over the years, thin silver lines that hardly showed any more that she no longer troubled to hide. She'd stopped covering them long ago. They were not her shame. They never had been. They were only proof, the last quiet proof, that she was a woman who had survived something that had tried very hard to end her, and had come out the other side not broken, but forged harder and warmer and freer than the fear had ever let her dream she could be. She had not come west looking for a husband. She had come looking for a chance to survive one more day in a stranger's house 300 miles from the man who owned her. That was all she'd dared to hope for. Survival. One more day. And she had found instead the whole of a life, a home, a family, a purpose, and a man who had looked at her hidden scars and seen not a broken thing to pity, but a strength to honor. A man who asked who hurt you when the whole world only ever asked what's wrong with her. Clara Whitfield spent the rest of her days free and loved and unafraid, and she used every one of those days to reach back and pull other frightened women into the light she'd found. And no one, not Thomas Caldwell, nor the ghost of him, nor any fear he'd ever planted in her, ever took a single one of those days from her again.